My family always assumed I was insignificant, but they never imagined that in silence I had been hiding $17 million. And the most painful part is that I didn't keep it secret out of spite. With time, I simply learned that when people look at you as if you're worth nothing, it's because they never saw you with their heart. I wish I had understood that before the night my own daughter yelled at me in front of everyone, "Stop pretending to be poor, Mom. If you live like this, it's because you want to." I felt something inside me break. No one there knew I had just received the hardest diagnosis of my life. No one knew I had spent months struggling to stay on my feet. No one knew that all I wanted was a hug. Just one. But instead, they humiliated me as if I were a burden. I still remember how it all began. I had prepared a simple dinner to share with my 2 children and my 3 grandchildren. Nothing fancy, but made with love. Rice, baked chicken, a pitcher of lemonade. My hands were shaking from exhaustion, but I just wanted to see them happy. They arrived, speaking loudly, laughing among themselves, not even greeting me with a kiss on the cheek. They walked in as if the house belonged to anyone but me. Carla, my oldest daughter, stared at the table and muttered, "Mom, is this what you're serving? I don't understand how you can live like this. So mediocre." I swallowed hard. I didn't reply. I've always been peaceful, always avoiding conflict. But that night, there was a knot in my throat that wouldn't let me breathe. My grandchildren, who used to run to hug me, sat down without enthusiasm, their eyes glued to their phones. My youngest son, Daniel, didn't even look me in the eyes. He checked his watch, as if he were in a hurry to leave, as if being with me was a heavy obligation. I walked over with the pitcher of lemonade and gently asked him, "Sweetheart, would you like some?" He sighed, annoyed, and answered without looking at me, "No, Mom, thanks. It has too much sugar." A sting hit my chest. I had made it the way he liked it when he was a boy. But of course, now I was nothing more than a tired old woman who couldn't do anything right. When everyone sat down, Carla raised her voice, irritated because the fan was making noise. "Mom, seriously, you should sell this house already. I don't know why you cling to this old place. You don't have the money to maintain it." My son added, "Yeah, and you being here alone. Don't you think it's time to consider a nursing home? It would be better for you. They'd take care of you there." That was the hardest blow. A nursing home. For me. For the woman who did everything for them, who raised them alone, who worked until my hands cracked, who gave up my dreams so they could chase theirs. I took a deep breath. I looked at the table. And for a moment, I thought about telling them. I thought about revealing that I wasn't the poor woman they imagined. That for 20 years I had worked as the administrator of a small family business that against all odds became a massive company. That when the owner passed away, he left me shares worth millions. That for years I let them see me as humble just to keep my peace. But that night when my own daughter accused me of ruining her life with my misery, and my son suggested locking me away like old furniture, I understood something. They weren't humiliating a poor woman. They were humiliating their mother. And even so, I stayed silent. Because I knew something they didn't. Something that would change everything. Something that, once they found out, would crush the ego that blinded them. Something that would reveal who the poor old lady they looked down on really was. Before I continue, I want to know, from which country or city are you watching us? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. That night, after everyone finished eating in silence, because they didn't even have the courtesy to say thank you, they began talking among themselves as if I didn't exist. I was slowly clearing the table, feeling a weight in my chest that I couldn't tell if it was sadness, exhaustion, or both. I heard my oldest granddaughter whisper to her mother, "This house smells weird, like old people." She didn't even bother to lower her voice. I don't know what hurt more, those words, or the way Carla pretended she didn't hear me when I offered to bring her a little dessert. She simply nodded without looking at me, without saying thank you. That indifference. It hurts more than a scream. As I washed the dishes, I heard them talking about me. I was in the kitchen, but the walls were thin, and their murmurs cut through like blades. "We need to convince her to sell the house," Carla said, using that cold tone she reserved for when she wanted something from me. "If she doesn't, we'll have to take care of the repairs. And I'm not wasting my money on this." My son replied, "If she moves into a home, the house would be empty. And we could use it. It's a good property. We could put it under our names, right?" There was an uncomfortable silence. He knew it was wrong, but he said it anyway. As if my life, my memories, everything I had built were objects they could divide among themselves. I placed my hands on the sink, trembling. It was like listening to strangers planning what to do with my things after I died. No one asked how I felt. No one remembered my sacrifices. No one mentioned the nights I froze so they could have warm clothes, or the days I didn't eat so they could have their 3 meals. Memory gets short when the heart is small. After a while, Daniel approached the kitchen. I thought he was coming to help me, or at least to talk. But no. He leaned on the doorway and said with indifference, "Mom, look, it's not that we're being mean, okay? But you're not like you used to be. You can't live alone anymore. And look at this house. It's falling apart. Why won't you accept our help?" What help? I thought as I looked at him. They weren't offering help. They were planning to push me out of the place where I had lived for over 40 years. They were telling me I was useless, a burden. I took a breath and replied as gently as I could, "Sweetheart, I don't need you to take me out of my home. I just need a little affection." He frowned, as if I had said something ridiculous. "Mom, this isn't about affection. It's about logic. You can't maintain this place. You don't have money." That sentence stabbed my soul. You don't have money. How easy it was to judge. How easy it was to look only at the surface. How easy it was to assume that an older woman, dressed simply and living in a modest home, was poor. That's when I remembered everything I had done to get where I was. I remembered when, at 50, the owner of the small store where I worked asked me to help him manage his accounts. I remembered the years in which the store expanded, little by little, until it became a chain. I remembered the day he told me, "You're the only person I trust. Take these shares. One day, they'll be worth more than you imagine." I never thought about selling them, never thought about bragging, never thought about telling the world I had a treasure saved. I lived with what was necessary because, honestly, that's how I was happy. But no one understood. When I finished washing the dishes, I returned to the living room with a tray of little cookies I had made for the kids. Only then did I dare to look my children in the eyes. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked with a fragile smile. Carla sighed loudly. "Mom, seriously, why do you do this? You exhaust yourself for nothing. Look at your hands. You're shaking. Don't you get that you can't handle these things anymore? What are you waiting for? To fall here alone?" Her words were poisoned darts, wrapped in a fake layer of concern. But underneath, there was pure impatience. My younger grandson, without lifting his eyes from the phone, said, "I'm bored. When are we leaving?" My heart shrank, as if someone were squeezing it. "In a moment, sweetheart," I said. He didn't answer, didn't even look at me. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Carla finally said what she had come to say. "Mom, we've already made a decision. I got you an interview at a very nice senior home. You don't have to worry about anything. I'll sign the papers." I looked at her, my daughter, my little girl, the one I carried in my arms, the one I nursed through fevers, the one I defended from the whole world. That same daughter was deciding my future without even asking me. "Carla, I'm not going anywhere," I said softly. She laughed. She actually laughed, as if I were a joke. "Mom, please, don't be stubborn. Why would you want to stay here? You don't have the means to live." That last sentence was the drop that spilled everything. Because that day, that very day, I had received an important phone call, a call no one in that room knew about, a call that would change everything. My lawyer told me that the shares I had kept for more than 2 decades had finally been sold. The final amount, $17 million. $17 million they never imagined existed. $17 million that belonged to me. $17 million I never intended to show off, but that I did intend to use someday to secure a dignified old age. And there they were, humiliating me, judging me, dismissing me. When I stayed silent, Carla crossed her arms. "Mom, this is not negotiable. If you don't want to go through the long process, we'll just—" I didn't let her finish, not because I wanted to defend myself, but because something in my heart had shifted. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't the one who needed my family. They were the ones who needed me, and they didn't know it yet. When they finally left, the house fell into a silence that hurt. I walked slowly to my bedroom, sat at the edge of the bed, and took a deep breath. I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. It was as if, after so many years, I could finally see the true heart of my own children. And I didn't like what I saw. My hands were trembling. I didn't know if it was because of age, exhaustion, or the truth weighing inside me. 17 million. A number so big it sounded like a joke. A number my children would never have imagined. And yet, what twisted my stomach the most wasn't the money, but the way they treated me, the way they had stopped seeing me as a person. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Carla's voice saying she would have me institutionalized. I heard Daniel talking about my house as if it were an empty lot. I heard my grandchildren complaining about my kitchen, my smell, my life. And then I remembered something. A promise I made to myself many years ago. Never allow anyone to decide for me. Never allow anyone to take away my dignity. I had survived worse things in life. Poverty, loss, the silent violence of a marriage that never worked. I had been strong so many times. How could I let myself fall now? I got up before dawn. I made strong black coffee, just the way I like it. I drank it sitting by the window as I watched the sun rise. The sky was stained pink, and in that moment, I understood. Maybe it was time for me to be reborn too. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer's number. He answered, half asleep. "Mrs. Alvarez?" "Good morning, dear," I said. "I need us to begin the procedures as soon as possible." "The investment ones?" he asked. "No, the other ones. I want to get my accounts in order, and I want to talk about my house." There was a brief, respectful silence. "Of course, ma'am. I'll prepare everything today." I hung up. I felt a strange calm, as if, for the first time, I was taking a step towards something I had postponed for years. I spent the entire morning cleaning the house, not because it was dirty, but because I needed to feel that I could still take care of myself. I swept, washed the sheets, dusted the furniture. Each movement felt like lifting a weight off my heart. When I finished, I showered and put on a simple but pretty dress. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a strong woman. A woman who had survived everything. A woman who had underestimated her own worth for far too long. That day, I received a message from Carla. Cold, short, dry. "Mom, I'll pick you up on Monday to see the senior home. Everything's ready." Not a, "How are you feeling?" Not a, "Did you sleep well?" Nothing. I didn't reply. Instead, I called my friend Rosa, the only person who had always been by my side without expecting anything. When she heard the tremor in my voice, she came immediately. She sat with me in the living room and held my hand. "What happened, Maria?" And there I broke. I told her everything, every word, every gesture, every humiliation. She listened, her eyes filling with tears, and whispered, "They don't deserve you." That sentence felt like an embrace to my soul. We spent hours talking. She reminded me who I had been, who I was, who I could be. She made me see that motherhood is not an eternal chain of sacrifice without reciprocity. That sometimes the family you choose is worth more than the family you're born into. And it was Rosa who said something that changed everything. Maybe it's time they learn a lesson. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with the truth. The truth. That word echoed inside me. The truth of my years of effort, the truth of my silence, the truth of my hidden fortune, the truth that I was not a burden, the truth that they had forgotten to love me. A week passed, a week in which I gathered my papers, my documents, my memories, a week in which I prepared myself for something big, for a change, for a point of no return, until the day finally came. Monday. Carla knocked on the door at 9 on the dot, as if she were completing a mandatory task rather than visiting her mother. She looked rushed, holding her phone with an expression of irritation. "Mom, let's go. I don't have much time." I looked at her calmly, a calm she didn't understand. "I'm not going to any home, Carla." She sighed, rolled her eyes, and said, "We already talked about this. You can't live alone. You don't have the resources." I smiled, a soft, peaceful smile. "Are you sure?" She frowned. And then I knew the moment had come. The moment to show my own children who the woman they thought insignificant really was. The moment of truth was about to begin. When Carla showed up at my door that Monday and told me she had everything ready to have me placed, I felt something break inside me. But it wasn't sadness this time. No, it was a new clarity, a strength I didn't know I had until that day. I had spent my whole life letting others decide for me, letting others raise their voices, letting others feel superior. But that day, I decided no, not anymore. My story was not going to end in an institution where no one knew me, loved me, or understood my silences. So I took a deep breath and told her I wasn't going anywhere. She didn't take it well. I saw her stiffen, irritated, annoyed, like I was an unruly child. And in that moment, I realized something terrible. My daughter wasn't speaking to me as a daughter, but as someone who believed she owned my life. I watched her in silence. I saw her checking her phone, annoyed because I wasn't rushing outside. I watched her calculating schedules, routes, commitments, as if I were an inconvenient package she needed to deliver. And while she grew impatient, I thought of everything I had lived through that week. The nights I stayed awake reviewing documents, the calls with my lawyer, the tears I wiped away when no one was looking. I had reached my breaking point, the point every humiliated person reaches eventually, where pain no longer destroys you, it pushes you. Carla kept talking, but I was no longer listening to her words. I was listening to my own heart repeating a sentence that wouldn't let me rest. It's time for the truth. Because throughout my life, my children judged me by what they saw. A simple woman with modest clothes, who cooked with what she had, who never wasted money, who lived without luxuries. They never imagined the real weight of my silences. They never imagined that behind my worn hands were decades of work. They never imagined that small store would become a commercial giant. They never imagined that the owner, generous and grateful, would leave me part of his shares. They never imagined those shares would grow the way they did. They never imagined that I, the woman they treated as incapable, owned $17 million. I had kept that information hidden for years. It had been my deepest secret, not because I didn't trust my children, but because I wanted peace. I wanted a simple, quiet, authentic life. I wanted to secure my old age without depending on anyone. But when I saw them forcing me to sell my house, when I heard them planning to sign papers without my consent, when they hinted that I was no longer useful, I knew hiding the truth no longer made sense. Because it wasn't just money I had been protecting. It was dignity. It was respect. It was an entire life of sacrifices they never acknowledged. That Monday, while Carla waited impatiently and told me to hurry, I went to retrieve a folder I had left on the dining table. It was a thick folder filled with organized documents, notarized signatures, and account statements. I didn't need to say a word. I didn't need long speeches. I simply placed the folder in front of her, in silence. I remember her confused expression, her furrowed brow, her irritation slowly transforming into surprise. And although she began flipping through the papers, I didn't focus on her reaction. I focused on myself, on what I felt in my chest. It was like taking a breath after years underwater. That was my turning point. Not because I had revealed the money, but because I understood that my value never depended on what others thought of me. It depended on my story, my strength. Every night I worked late, every sacrifice I made in silence, every tear I shed when no one was watching. And yet, I also realized that revealing the truth wasn't enough to heal. Because money can open eyes, but it cannot open hearts. Carla looked up at me, stunned. I didn't need to hear her voice to know what she was thinking. I saw it in her eyes. Surprise, disbelief, greed, fear, confusion, all tangled together. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, that she might say something heartfelt. But no. Instead, I realized that all that folder had done was shift the role she thought she had. She was no longer the controlling daughter who believed she could decide for me. Now she was the shocked daughter, unsure how to behave in the face of such a truth. I inhaled slowly. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. And yet, instead of victory, I felt a deep sadness, because I realized money wasn't going to make my children love me more. It wasn't going to erase the humiliations. It wasn't going to give me back the dinners where they ignored me. It wasn't going to restore the hugs that had stopped coming. It wasn't going to rebuild a family that had been broken long before. Carla left my house without saying much. Not because she was offended, but because she didn't know how to face the truth. And I stayed there, in the silence of my living room, looking at my hands, feeling a mixture of freedom and loneliness. I had gained something, yes, but I had also lost something. And maybe it was what I had always known. Love cannot be bought. Neither can respect. The days that followed were a chain of reactions. Daniel showed up with a timidity I hadn't seen in years. My grandchildren called like they never had before. Carla sent messages trying to sound concerned, but it was already too late. I wasn't angry. I was awake. For the first time in decades, I was awake. And in that clarity, my most important decision was born. I would never again allow anyone to decide for me. I would not allow my life to end in a cold institution. I would not allow my final years to be controlled by others. I had earned my freedom. I had earned my dignity. And now, it was time to use them. That was the beginning of my plan, my real plan. Not to seek revenge, not to punish them, but to rebuild myself, to be reborn. To prove, above all to myself, that I was still in charge of my own destiny. What I chose to do next changed everything forever. After that silent revelation, something inside me changed completely. It wasn't the money, it wasn't the power, it was awareness. The awareness that I had lived far too many years small, shrinking myself so I wouldn't inconvenience anyone, accepting emotional crumbs from the very people for whom I gave everything. And when you understand that, when you truly understand it, you can never go back. The days that followed were strange. My house had a different kind of silence. Not the sad silence that used to accompany me, but one I was learning to inhabit. It was a silence that didn't suffocate me. It held me. It reminded me that the house was mine, that the space belonged to me, that I didn't need permission to exist. I woke up early, made my coffee, opened the windows, and let the light in. For years I had kept the curtains closed. I don't even know why. Now every morning I opened them with an almost sacred ritual, as if telling the world, I'm here. During those days, I reflected a lot on my life. I thought about my childhood, about poverty, about the blows from life that shaped me. I thought about my marriage, so cold, so full of uncomfortable silence. I thought about my children, who grew up without seeing what I did. They always believed I was strong, capable, hardworking. They grew up trusting my hands, but not my heart. And now that they were adults, they seemed to have forgotten that I once gave them life. Every night I repeated something to myself. You are not a burden. You weren't born to be discarded. You are not alone. I repeated it because for a long time I believed the opposite. I had allowed my children's voices to be louder than my own, let their criticism dim my light, let their humiliation define my worth. But something had awakened. An old strength, buried but intact. That's when I made a decision. I was going to rebuild my life from scratch. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I deserved it. I deserved to live with dignity, with joy, with peace. I deserved to enter my final years with my head held high, not with fear that someone might rip me away from my home. So I started with the basics, reclaiming my autonomy. At first it was hard. My hands trembled, my knees ached, memories chased me. But every action, no matter how small, became an act of resistance. I cleaned my backyard, the one my children called old and neglected, but that for me was full of memories. I pulled out the dead plants and planted new ones. Young plants, green, full of life. I liked the idea that at my age, I could still plant something. I also organized my finances, not to show off, but to gain peace. I opened new accounts, organized my papers, put in my name what I had long abandoned. My lawyer guided me patiently, and when I finished, it felt as if I had closed a heavy door that had been open for decades. One day, Rosa came to visit again. I was preparing tea, humming an old song from my youth when she arrived. She looked at me and smiled. You look different, she said. And I did. Not younger, not physically stronger, but more whole, more myself. I began to think about what I wanted to do with my future. For the first time in many years, the question didn't frighten me. I could move, travel, study something new, open a small business, donate part of my fortune. I could live however I wanted. That freedom brought tears to my eyes. But before doing anything, I needed to heal something inside me. A deep wound my children opened with their words, but that I myself had allowed to grow. The idea that I no longer had value. The idea that, because I was older, I had to step aside, surrender, give everything up. No, I wasn't going to allow that anymore. I began walking through my neighborhood every morning, slowly, but with purpose. I felt the air on my face, the sun on my skin, the trees moving above me as if greeting me. People saw me and smiled, and I realized I had never stopped belonging to the world. I had just hidden from it for too long. I also started eating better, taking care of myself, treating myself kindly. Small things I had stopped doing because I thought they didn't matter. But they did matter, more than I ever realized. One afternoon, while drinking tea, a memory struck me hard. My children didn't know who I was. Not really. They didn't know my story, my sacrifices, my struggles, my triumphs. They had only seen me as a source of care, as a refuge, as a kitchen that was always warm. And maybe that was my mistake, giving them so much of myself that they forgot I was also a person. But I didn't want to fall into resentment. Resentment only ages the heart. I wanted to live light, to let go, to move forward. So I decided to forgive them, not for their sake, not to soothe their conscience, but for me. So I wouldn't carry that weight for the rest of my days. Forgiving didn't mean letting them back into my soul. It meant stopping the bleeding from what they had done. It was an immense release. After that, I began thinking about the next step. What would I do with my money? What would I do with my remaining years? What would I do with my newly recovered freedom? And that's when the idea was born. An idea that would change everything. To use that fortune not to punish, not to buy affection, not to show off, but to build a new life, one made for me, shaped to fit me. A life that would give me back the sparkle I had lost so long ago. But before moving forward, I had to resolve the most painful and necessary part, facing my children, not with anger, not with shouting, but with the whole truth, with my firm voice, with my clear boundaries, with my dignity intact. I needed to look at the woman reflected in my mirror, the woman who had survived everything, and ask her if she was ready for what was coming. And for the first time in my life, the answer was a resounding yes. The conversation I would have with them would open a door that could never be closed again. And even if my hands trembled, even if my heart pounded, I knew it was time to reclaim my place in this world. What happened next marked the beginning of the most powerful part of my story. The day I decided to confront my children dawned differently. I don't know if it was the weather, the light, or simply my own heart, but something felt final, as if my life had been waiting for that moment for decades. I got up early, made coffee, and sat at the table where I had cried in silence so many times. This time I didn't cry. I simply looked at my hands, my old hands, marked, full of stories, and I told myself, today you take back what has always been yours, your voice. Days had passed since my daughter saw the documents. Days of persistent calls, long messages, rushed attempts to fix what they had broken. But I did not respond. I needed time to settle my soul before opening the door. I didn't want to speak from pain. I wanted to speak from truth, a clean truth, firm, without shouting, without playing the victim. That morning, I wrote in a notebook everything I felt, not to read it to them, but to free it from my chest. I wrote about my fears, about how it felt to be treated like a burden, about the loneliness they left me in, about how my heart broke hearing them plan my future without even asking me. I wrote about my sleepless nights, about the lawyer's call, about the millions I never flaunted, about the dignity I lost and reclaimed. When I finished, my hands were trembling, but not from weakness. It was as if my body understood I was about to close an enormous chapter. At noon, the doorbell rang. I knew they would come. I knew that moment would arrive. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and there they were. Not like last time. They stood with tense, anxious expressions, unsure, confused. They didn't speak immediately. They just exchanged glances, waiting to see who would begin. But I didn't need to hear them to know why they were there. It was no longer concern, it was fear. Fear of losing something they didn't even know I had. I invited them in. They walked through the house as if seeing it for the first time. Maybe for the first time, they noticed my old photos, my new plants, the freshly washed tablecloth. Maybe for the first time, they noticed there was life in this house. They sat across from me at the same table where they once told me I should go to a nursing home. That memory hurt, but I did not let it weaken me. There were no screams, no fights. I didn't need that. Instead of talking about money, I told them how I felt. I didn't list offenses, I listed silences. I explained, in simple words, how it felt to hear that they wanted to institutionalize me, how it felt to be told I had no value, how it felt to clean my kitchen that day feeling invisible, how it felt to be ignored by my grandchildren, how it felt to realize that my own children no longer saw me. Speaking from the soul was harder than revealing millions, but it was also more powerful. As I spoke, I saw on their faces a mix of discomfort and guilt, not because they truly understood, but because they never imagined I would dare say it. For years I had remained silent, and I think that made them believe my feelings didn't exist, that my silence was acceptance, that my gentleness was weakness. I finished speaking with a knot in my throat, but I didn't cry. I didn't want tears at that moment. I wanted clarity, and that's when the climax of my story happened. I stood up, went to the cabinet, and returned with the documents that proved my fortune. But this time I didn't drop them on the table. I didn't push them toward them. I didn't seek impact. I held them in my hands, and I told them, without drama, that I had lived with only what I needed not because of poverty, but by choice. That the money was mine, that I had earned it, that I had kept it in silence because I never cared to show off anything. Their faces changed completely. On those faces, the same ones I saw as newborns. I witnessed emotions I never expected: deep shock, fear, disbelief, regret, interest, confusion, even shame. It was like watching the collapse of the image they had built of me, the image that made them feel entitled to humiliate me. And there, in front of them, as they processed everything they heard, I understood something that set me free. I no longer needed them to love me the way they once did. I wasn't seeking apologies. I only needed them to know who I truly was, to stop looking down on me, to recognize me not for my money, but for my story. I told them I would no longer allow them to decide for me, that I would no longer accept disrespect, that I wasn't going to any home, that this house was mine, and I would decide what happened to it, that my life belonged to me, that, for the first time in decades, I was ready to live it the way I wanted. That moment was the real climax. Not the money, not their reaction, not their shock, but my voice, my courage, my decision. My children tried to respond. I didn't interrupt them. I listened. But inside, I expected nothing. And that was exactly what made me strong. When a mother stops expecting her children to fill her emptiness, she becomes an invincible woman. When they left, my house didn't feel empty. It felt mine, completely mine. I closed the door gently and felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. I had faced my greatest fear, being alone. And you know what I discovered? That loneliness isn't so frightening when it comes hand in hand with freedom. That night I stepped into the backyard, looked at the sky, and knew that the next chapter of my life began right there, in my silence, in my calm, in my personal victory. But there was still one important decision left, one that would completely define my story and the direction of my life. What I did with my fortune was not what anyone expected. After that day, when my children left with their heads lowered and their hearts unsettled, my home settled into a different kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy silence that suffocated me before, but a silence, clean, as if the air had finally cleared after a long storm. I closed the door gently and stayed there, resting my hand against the wood, breathing. It was the first time in a long while that I felt that this house, my house, was once again a refuge, not a reminder of my wounds. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table where I had swallowed my words so many times. Now there was nothing left to swallow. I had said everything. I had released everything. And as I drank, I realized something profound. I had spent entire decades living for others. For my children, for my ex-husband, for my family, for everyone who expected me to always be available, to solve, to fix, to care. And in doing so, I had forgotten to care for myself. But that cycle had ended. The next morning, I woke up early, as always, but with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I made myself a real breakfast, opened all the windows, played soft music. I walked through each room and felt immense gratitude for still having a home that belonged to me, a life I could still shape, a future that wasn't lost. That's when I asked myself what I wanted to do with the rest of my days. Not with my money, with my life. Because I understood something. The fortune wasn't what had truly changed me. It was the courage I had discovered within myself. And I thought, if I spent so many years dimmed, why not live the rest of my life in light? I sat on my sofa with a notebook and began writing. Not tasks or obligations, but wishes. Forgotten wishes. Things I always wanted to do, but never allowed myself to imagine. Travel to a beautiful place, take a new class, treat myself to a spa day, walk along the beach again. Even something I had never said aloud, learn to paint. I had always loved colors. I had always dreamed of putting them on a canvas. As I wrote, I found myself smiling. A quiet, peaceful smile, the kind that appears when the soul stretches after being curled up for years. Then I made another important decision, to speak with my lawyer. Not to hide anything, but to organize what would become my new life. I felt I had reached a point where I needed to protect myself from myself, from my impulse to give too much, from my instinct to rescue everyone except me. So I asked him to place my fortune in a secure trust, one that would allow me to live comfortably, but without letting anyone manipulate me. For the first time, I was building a life with my well-being in mind. That same week, I began experiencing something new, my own company. Instead of waiting for calls, instead of feeling anxious about others' opinions, instead of measuring my actions by whether they would bother someone, I discovered that being alone could be beautiful. I prepared good meals just for myself, organized my home the way I liked, walked to the market, sat in the park to watch people pass by. I began noticing colors, sounds, flavors I had ignored before. It was as if I had been asleep for years and had finally awakened. My children, meanwhile, kept trying to get closer. They called more often, sent messages, asked how I was. But now, for the first time, I was in control. I answered when I wanted, not when I felt obligated. I responded with respect, calmly, but without letting them cross boundaries. I had discovered that setting limits wasn't a lack of love. It was self-love. And then the moment came that would define my new life, deciding what to do with my house. Not because they asked, not because someone pressured me, but because I wanted something new. I knew that house carried too many memories, good ones, painful ones. And even though I loved it, it also represented a version of myself that no longer existed. One day I got up, walked down the hallway, and stopped in the living room. I looked at every corner and felt it was time to close that chapter. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. I called my lawyer and asked him to start the process of selling it. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed freedom. I wanted to choose a place that reflected the woman I was becoming. I searched for weeks until I found a small apartment near the ocean. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't extravagant. It was simple, bright, peaceful. A space for me, for my new flowers, for my books, for my paintbrushes. A space where I could breathe without carrying the weight of my past life. I moved in alone. I took few things with me. I left behind old furniture, painful memories, objects that no longer meant anything. I carried only photographs, clothes, a few kitchen utensils, and the feeling of being reborn. When I entered that new home for the first time, I felt a peace so deep it moved me. I walked to the window, looked at the sea, and knew I had made the right decision. The day I handed over the keys to my old house, I didn't cry. I didn't break. I didn't regret. I simply thanked in silence for everything I had lived there and walked forward. With time, I created a routine that made me happy. I walked along the shore every morning, learned new recipes, enrolled in an art class for older adults, made new friends, even joined book clubs. I rediscovered myself. I rebuilt myself. I returned to myself. My children continued to stay in touch, but our relationship was different. They were no longer owners of my time or my peace. And although I still felt a deep ache when I remembered how they treated me, I also understood that I couldn't change their hearts. I could only protect mine. And then came the most important moment, deciding what to do with my $17 million. I didn't want to let it sit without purpose. I didn't want it to become a family war. I didn't want it to feed old ambitions. I wanted to turn my blessing into something meaningful. And so the idea was born, to create a community fund, a small support program for older women who, like me, had been overlooked, abandoned, humiliated, or dismissed by their own families. Women who, after a lifetime of sacrifice, found themselves without support and with broken hearts. I wanted to offer them workshops, therapy, companionship, resources, but above all, a chance to be reborn, just as I had. When I outlined that plan, I felt an emotion so intense it gave me chills. For the first time, I understood that my story, with all its pain, could transform other lives. That was my closure, not a sad ending, not a bitter ending, a dignified ending. An ending in which I became the protagonist of my own life. What came after was light. Today, as I tell you all of this, I'm sitting in my little apartment by the sea. There's a cup of warm tea beside me, and the sound of the waves drifts through the window as if they were embracing me. I never imagined that at my age I would begin a new life. But that's exactly what happened. A life shaped to fit me, without fear, without humiliation, without forced silence. It's been months since I left my old house and settled here. Every sunrise feels like a gift. I walk along the shore, feel the warm sand beneath my feet, listen to my own steps and tell myself, you did it. Not because of the money, not because of the strength. I did it because I recovered something I thought was lost forever. My voice, my worth, my dignity. My children are still part of my life, yes, but in a different way. They call me every week. Sometimes they visit, and I notice a different tone in them. I don't know if it's remorse, guilt, or simply the surprise of discovering who I am now. I don't hold resentment, but I don't forget either. They learned, and I learned with them, that love is not demanded, it is nurtured. Respect is not begged for, it is drawn as a boundary. I never gave them more details about my money. Not because I want to punish them, but because I understood that the true inheritance I can leave isn't millions, but the example of a woman who stood up when everyone thought she was defeated. My project for older women moves slowly, but it moves. There are 12 of us now, each with different stories, each with similar wounds. We meet every Thursday in a small community room. We share coffee, sweetbread, and experiences. We cry, we laugh, we listen. Some smile again after years. Others are only beginning to try. I am learning too, because healing is also a path walked together. Sometimes I sit in my painting class and look at my hands covered in colors. I think of the woman I used to be, the one who hid behind a small life, who stayed quiet to avoid bothering anyone, who let others decide for her. And then I look at the woman I am now, with her wrinkles, her story, her reborn strength, and I hug myself from the inside. I tell myself I made it. I survived. I blossomed late, but I blossomed strong. People are often surprised when they hear my story. An old woman who seemed to have nothing and had 17 million. But if you ask me what my real wealth is, I won't talk about money. I'll talk about this moment, this peace, this freedom I carry in my soul. If my story touches your heart, don't leave yet. Stay with me, with us, in this space where the voices of older women matter, carry weight, and resonate. Join our family, subscribe, and share this message of strength and courage.